Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. For today's video, we are going to continue with the book of John. So we are currently on John chapter 7. I'm so excited to continue to read this with you guys. This is such a good chapter. And I think as we continue to read through John, you just get to know more of Jesus's character, which I love. So feel free to grab your Bible, read along with me, and we'll dive right into John chapter 7. Okay, so starting in verse 1, it says, "After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He did not want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him." And remember from the previous chapters that Jesus faced a lot of opposition from these Jewish leaders. And then in verse 2, it says, "But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, 'Leave Galilee and go to Judea so that your disciples there may see the works you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you are doing these things, show yourself to the world.' For even his own brothers did not believe in him." So quick stop here for a little bit of background. Back in verse 2, the Jewish festival of tabernacles is a week-long festival in September or October where everyone would travel to Jerusalem from wherever they are. They would take weeks and months to travel there in order to celebrate this Jewish festival. So Jesus's brothers are going and they're trying to convince him to come so that he can show off his works, so that he can show himself to the world and do all these things for display. And in one commentary, it says that his brothers are actually saying this to mock him for doing all these things and trying to become a public figure. And it says in verse 5, "For even his own brothers did not believe in him." And I actually highlighted verse 5 just because when I'm thinking about okay, how Jesus must be feeling at this point, just like he's receiving so much opposition from the Jewish leaders, from people who just think he's crazy, and even his own brothers don't believe that he's the Messiah. So I highlight verse 5 just as a reminder, even Jesus faced opposition. In fact, he faced a lot of opposition. And then in verse 6 it says, "Therefore Jesus told them, 'My time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I am not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come.' After he had said this, he stayed in Galilee." And there's two things that I want to call out here. The first one is just Jesus's awareness of his timing and just the timing of God's will, because he calls out first in verse 6 where he says, "My time is not yet here," and I underlined that. And then I also underlined in verse 8 when he said, "My time has not yet fully come." And I think it's so cool because it just goes to show his awareness and his desire to follow and stay in step with God's perfect timing. And then the second thing I want to call out is just the contrast and dichotomy between the world and Jesus. At this point, Jesus is kind of referencing to his brothers as still being of this world, and that's why the world cannot hate them. But on the other hand, Jesus is not of this world, and so that's why the world hates him, because he testifies that the world is evil. So he says this to his brothers, and then he stays in Galilee. And then in verse 10 it says, "However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret." And I highlighted in secret because he didn't want to draw attention to himself. He wanted to keep a low profile because if you remember the last time he was in town in John chapter 5 when he was healing the man at the pool of Bethesda, all the Jewish leaders were trying to kill him. So I can't blame him for wanting to keep a low profile. And then in verse 11 it says, "Now at the festival the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, 'Where is he?' Among the crowds there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, 'He is a good man.' Others replied, 'No, he deceives the people.' But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders." So here you can see that the people are very divided about who Jesus is. Some say that he is a good man, and other people think that he's crazy, he's a liar. So at this point, everyone is very divided about who he is, and everyone's just whispering amongst each other. And then in verse 14 it says, "Not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, 'How did this man get such learning without having been taught?' Jesus answered, 'My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. So here, halfway through the festival, Jesus starts to teach up at the temple. And this is like not a common thing to do, because unless you are a rabbi or you are a teacher, like an official teacher, no one just goes and teaches. But it says in verse 15, which I underlined, the Jews there were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having been taught? And so there's no doubt about it that what Jesus was teaching, the things that he was saying, he spoke from such a place of wisdom and knowledge that people were amazed. Like, who is this guy? Like, how, even though he doesn't have credentials, how is he able to speak with such wisdom and truth? And then Jesus explains, you know, it's because my teaching comes from God. And I think that's so important to just realize that Jesus is not like all these other teachers and all these other rabbis. He speaks with the direct authority of God, and that's why people are amazed. And in verse 17, I love how he addresses, like, anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. And he's kind of comparing like false prophets versus the truth, because people who are not speaking from God, it says that they do so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. So I feel like that just really goes to show, you know, how we ourselves can decipher who is speaking truth and who is speaking falsely for their own self-glory. And Jesus literally teaches us that we will know if it's the truth or if it's false by choosing to do the will of God. Knowing the Father, knowing God, we'll be able to decipher, okay, does this sound like truth or is this false teaching? So I love that Jesus addresses that here, because there's a lot of false teaching out there in this world. And so I think it's so true. We have to get to know God so that we are able to decipher for ourselves against if someone's speaking to seek the glory of themselves, or if someone's speaking actual truth. And then in verse 19 it says, has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? You are demon possessed, the crowd answered. Who is trying to kill you? Jesus said to them, I did one miracle and you are all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. And I highlighted that last section in verse 24 where Jesus says, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. And he's kind of calling these people out that they're not judging correctly. And they're calling him demon possessed. They're saying that he's crazy. But he's calling them out kind of logically, being like, okay, you guys are circumcising people on the Sabbath, so why can't I heal people on the Sabbath? And then verse 25, it says, at that point, some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, isn't this the man they are trying to kill? Here he is speaking publicly, and they are not saying a word to him. Have the authorities really concluded that he is the Messiah? But we know where this man is from. When the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from. I have to call it here, and I was reading in my commentary as well, that this actually is an incorrect statement that they were saying. So they were saying that no one will know where the Messiah comes from. No one will know where he is from. But in Micah 5:2, it actually says that he will come from Bethlehem. So it does actually say where he's from. And then also in verse 26, I highlighted here he is speaking publicly, even though they were just saying, isn't this the man he's trying to kill? And I think that this just goes to show the boldness of Jesus' character, that when it is the right time, like, he will speak publicly, even though, yes, they are trying to kill him, but he's not going to shy away or back down from telling people the truth. And then in verse 28, it says, then Jesus, still teaching in the temple courts, cried out, yes, you know me and you know where I am from. I am not here on my own authority, but he who sent me is true. You do not know him, but I know him because I am from him and he sent me. So here Jesus is saying that he's not here on his own. He's here because God sent him. He's directly from God. And then verse 30, I mean, they probably at this point, like, no one talks like this. So at this point in verse 30, it says, at this they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. And I underlined his hour in this verse because, again, it's timing. It wasn't the right timing. It wasn't God's ordained time yet. So I just think it just shows the importance of God's timing. And then verse 31, still many in the crowd believed in him. They said, when the Messiah comes, will he perform more signs than this man? The Pharisees heard the crowd whispering such things about him. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees sent temple guards to arrest him. Jesus said, I am with you for only a short time, and then I'm going to the one who sent me. You will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. And so the way that Jesus says this is kind of just foreshadowing what is to come. Jesus is foreshadowing his upcoming ascension to heaven, and they don't understand because he's talking about heaven. And then verse 35, the Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we cannot find him? Will he go where our people live scattered among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What did he mean when he said, you will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? And then in verse 37, on the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. And I highlighted in verse 37 the great invitation that Jesus says to everyone, let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink, and rivers of living water, he's talking about the Spirit, will flow within them. And I just love this because it just paints a picture that, like, if anyone who is thirsty, anyone who has a void, anyone who needs something, come to Jesus and he satisfies all. He fills all the voids. You will not thirst again. You can come to him and drink. And he's also foreshadowing the Spirit who has not yet come but will come later on, and just foreshadowing that through the Spirit, rivers of flowing water will flow from within them. And that's so true of us today. If we have Jesus in our hearts, like literal rivers of flowing living water are flowing within us. So in verse 39 it says, by this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. So since Jesus had not yet ascended to heaven, the Spirit had not yet come. And then verse 40, on hearing his words, some of the people said, surely this man is the prophet. Others said, he is the Messiah. Still others asked, how can the Messiah come from Galilee? Does not scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? So again, the people have a bunch of different opinions on Jesus, and they're saying a bunch of different things. Some people do believe he's the Messiah because he's just saying, they're just amazed at everything that he's saying. It's so wise and it's so true. And then others are thinking that he's just a prophet, and others are still thinking that there's still no way that he's the Messiah. And those people think that he's not the Messiah because it says the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived. But what they don't know is that even though Jesus came to Jerusalem from Galilee, he's not actually from Galilee. He actually is from Bethlehem. So what they're saying is actually true in this sentence where it says the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, because he did. And then verse 43, it says, thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Some wanted to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, why didn't you bring him in? Because remember, the Pharisees sent the temple guards to arrest Jesus. But then in verse 46, the temple guards says, no one ever spoke the way this man does, the guards replied. So even the guards are taking note of the fact that, okay, there's something different about this man. There's something different about the way he speaks. No one has ever spoken the way this man does. And again, I think it's just because Jesus truly speaks with so much truth and so much wisdom that can only come from God. And then in verse 47, the Pharisees are still not believing him. So they say, you mean he has deceived you also? The Pharisees retorted. Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed in him? No, but this mob that knows nothing of the law, there is a curse on them. So they're just like still being stubborn, like, okay, I don't care if you think that this man speaks differently or whatever, like, he's crazy, no one believes in him, why didn't you arrest him? And then verse 50, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked, does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he has been doing? And actually, if you guys remember Nicodemus all the way from John chapter 3, Nicodemus was one of the Pharisees that came to Jesus at night, so kind of like discreetly, to ask Jesus questions and to just find out a little bit more. And he actually, seeing all this that's happening, goes to the Pharisees and asks them, or tries to convince them, to not condemn him yet without a hearing. But I guess it falls kind of flat, because in verse 52, they replied, "Are you from Galilee too? Look into it and you will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee." And in my commentary, it says that these religious leaders who lived in Jerusalem despised the people of Galilee and often mocked them. To these religious leaders from Judea, nothing good can come from Galilee. So they're kind of asking Nicodemus, like, "Are you from Galilee too? Like, there's no way." And we're not listening, even though he was trying to convince the leaders on Jesus' behalf to not condemn him without a hearing. They were just not going to listen to him. So that is the end of John chapter 7. I want to just talk through some key takeaways from this chapter. The first key takeaway that I had was just timing, and how often time is mentioned in this chapter, whether it's Jesus saying, you know, in verse 6, "My time is not yet here, my time is not yet fully come," or in verse 30, because his hour had not yet come. I just think it's so important to be aware and cognizant, like Jesus was, of the timing of God, and just knowing that there is a time for every season and for everything that's supposed to happen. I personally just find so much comfort in that, just knowing that nothing happens outside of God's will and God's timing, and that he's working out everything in his perfect timing. Another key takeaway I had is in verse 16 and 17, where Jesus talks about how to discern true and false teachings. We know when a teaching is true when we know God and we're following his will and we're seeking to do his will and we're in close relationship with him. We will know and we will find out whether a teaching is true or false. And then also, false teachers, they do so to gain personal glory. They do not seek the glory of God. They do that to gain their personal glory, increase their numbers, or whatever it may be. I think it's so important that Jesus addresses that and teaches us how to discern true and false teaching. And then also another key takeaway that I noticed throughout this chapter is just Jesus's authority and how he speaks. And it says in verse 15 that when he was teaching at the temple courts, the Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught?" And even the temple guard said in verse 46, "No one ever spoke the way this man does." And I feel like it just goes to show, like, Jesus truly is the Son of God. He is truly from God. No one before taught like he taught, especially without having been like a formal rabbi or teacher. And he says things like, you know, "Anyone who is thirsty, come to me and drink." Like, that's the great invitation. And I think no one else other than the true Son of God would be able to say these things, or would even have the knowledge that is from God to be able to teach all these people. So those are just some of my key takeaways from this chapter, but I would love to hear yours down below in the comments. Thank you guys so much for reading along John chapter 7 with me, and I'm looking forward to doing John chapter 8 as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. I will see you all in my next video. Bye!